in you, this will give you an opportunity to testify. This will give you an opportunity to witness, an opportunity to speak in my name. When have you testified? When have you witnessed? When has God given you an opportunity to testify? Perhaps you have done so in subtle ways. Perhaps you've told your friends about your amazing church. Perhaps you've mentioned to a family member how many wonderful programs you've attended, or you've reminded yourself how diligent Elizabeth was in recruiting you to be on that team or on that committee, and how glad you were that she did. Perhaps you have noticed all of God's blessings that you've received and testified by thanking God out loud. But that's not the kind of testimony Jesus refers to in this passage. That testimony looks quite different. Upon seeing the temple rebuilt by Herod the Great, the followers crowding around Jesus voiced their wonder. They voiced their marvel at its beauty. And Jesus smacks that down pretty quickly. Not a stone will be left upon another. It will all be gone. None of it will last. Not only that, but you will also suffer. If you're wondering why Jesus might be saying this, you need only glance at the next chapter of Luke, in which Jesus is betrayed, arrested, denied, beaten, and tied. The dark times were surely upon them. Dark times in which all of Jesus' words came true. His followers were persecuted. They were imprisoned. Some of them were even killed for their faith. Dark times indeed. And what were the disciples to do in the midst of this deep darkness? In verse 13, Jesus says, "This will give you an opportunity to testify." That is his response. Because of all of this, you will have an opportunity to testify. To be honest, if I had been standing there listening to Jesus talk about the terrible fate which awaited me, and the only sliver of hope he seemed to have was that this will give you an opportunity to testify, I would have said, wait, what? This is like looking at your friend at the beginning of hour 8 in the emergency room after being injured, only to hear him say, at least it'll be a good story. Or getting hopelessly lost, driving around with your spouse, only to hear them say, we'll just make it an adventure. Come on, give me more than a good story. But this is the hope that Jesus offers. Members of my Bible study affirmed with me this week that we're not necessarily great at testifying. It's not really our thing. But I hear people around me doing it all the time. That was a moving service. This was a great meal. I'm so glad we did this mission project. These are all testimonies. These are times when you are saying to one another, God is doing amazing things. Isn't it wonderful? Testifying is telling our story. It's talking about why God means something to us, why we're Christian. And we do that a lot when things are going well. When that event was super well attended, when we got that whole ramp built in one morning, or when we sang 3 hymns, did communion, and had meaningful worship all in under an hour. These are times when testifying is easy. This is the testifying that the disciples want to do. Look at how beautiful that temple is. This is why I follow God. Look at how marvelous that structure is that God's people built. Jesus says, hold on, that's easy. But can you testify like that when things are not so great? The time is coming when everything is going to turn upside down, when the darkness is going to fall, and you're going to have an opportunity to testify. Will you? Jesus sees the bad times as an opportunity to witness. Think about it. If it's compelling to hear someone who is very happy and having a great time say, God is great, how much more compelling is it to hear someone who's really struggling, and has every reason to curse the world, say, God is great. When the diagnosis looks bad, when the storm didn't swerve out of their path, when the stock market tumbled, when the dream is now out of reach, how unbelievable, how unexpected, how compelling is it in that moment to say, God is great? It is unnatural for us to reject fear. But when God offers such incredible hope that we are unable to sit in the ashes, but we must cry out in spite of our situation, God is great, that is the sign of a powerful God. We are all aware of the reality of difficult times. We are human, after all. And so we know the reality of the human condition. We are attuned to struggle and strife, to pain and fear. Either right now or at some point in the past or at some point in the future, we have a personal experience of the kind that Jesus describes: loss and heartache, rejection and death. Our losses are as varied as our experiences. Our parent has died. Our dream has faded from view. Our stress has overcome our ability to cope. Our job is not what we hoped it would be. Loss is real. If you will permit me to be honest with you, this week has been a dark time for me. I can't prove it, but I think Elizabeth planned for me to be preaching on the Sunday after the election. The result of this election has been personally troubling for me as I think about the people I love and the people whom Christ calls me to love. Now, that may not be everyone's experience. It may not have been yours. And neither must it be, for you and I are not the same people. Thanks be to God, we are created to be different. Your experience of the election this week may have been one of joy and celebration. Thanks be to God that we live in a country, we share a world, and we worship a God who allows us to live together and love each other in the midst of our disagreements. Thanks be to God for that. But from a place of authenticity, I must say, my experience this week has been one of darkness. So I have been asking myself, how does my faith call me to respond to my dark times? First, I think God gives us the space to react really poorly. As we are shown in the Psalms, we are part of a holy tradition of anger, frustration, sadness, fear, and grieving. This is part of a faithful response. Following the death of a personal plan and a hope for the future, how could one not grieve, yell, cry, or maybe even post a few snarky comments to Facebook? But that's not where God calls us to stay. A friend of mine, who is a beautiful writer, posted this during a particularly trying time in his life. Our eldest son wants to hear stories about a boy who gets hurt too much. He means bee stings and splinters and biting his tongue, stuff that happens every day. But this is no every day, and so I started to cry. I say, I don't think I can talk about the hurt right now, my love. But Daddy, the story never ends with the hurt. You keep telling the story until you get to the heel. God doesn't call us to stay in the grief and the anger and the pain. God calls us to tell the story. God calls us to testify. God calls us to testify to the truth of this world that God created, to testify to the truth of the God who created it, that God is able to redeem all things. God is able to redeem broken people. God is able to redeem broken families, broken systems, broken lives. If God is able to redeem all things, then God is able to redeem the brokenness that surrounds us, whatever that brokenness might be. If that brokenness is that of death, God calls us to testify to life. If the brokenness is loss, God calls us to testify to being found. If the brokenness is hopelessness in our nation's future, God calls us to pray and work to bring hope again. This is the important role that Christians play in times of loss, in times of heartache. So many conversations over the past week may have been consumed by politics, so much so that it seems politics may have become the new religion, and voting policies and campaign promises the new theology. But it's time for Christians to reclaim that theological conversation. It's time for us to remind ourselves and our fellow citizens the value of the gospel's good news. No matter who we voted for or what our political agenda is, there are some things we need to be clear about as Christians. We need to unequivocally stand up for the poor, the oppressed, the feared foreigner, the misunderstood minority, the powerless woman. We need to spend time talking about the Good Samaritan, the one whom we despise, the one with whom we disagree. We need to affirm that we are stewards of this creation, not its owners, and we need to take care of it. We need to state outright that we don't condone hate of anyone, of any background, for any reason. We need to say these things, not because we voted for this person or that, not because we won and someone else didn't, but because it's what Jesus tells us to do, because we testify to the good news of the gospel, because we're Christian. When we do this, when we continue to do what Christ tells us to do, when we testify in the midst of our darkness, we continue telling the story. We refuse to stop at the hurt. I've been simultaneously heartbroken and inspired by the story of Thomas Dorsey this week. Thomas Dorsey was a singer and songwriter from rural Georgia. He struggled to provide for his family on the salary of a musician, playing in churches and in bars. In August of 1932, Dorsey left his pregnant wife at home in Chicago to play at a revival in St. Louis. After the first night of the revival, he received a telegram saying simply, "Your wife just died." Dorsey rushed home to discover that his wife had died in childbirth, his son dying the following day. After burying his family, he withdrew in sorrow. In the midst of his despair, he sat in front of a piano, and a feeling of peace washed over him. He heard a melody that he had never played before in his head. And the next day, he recorded his testimony. He told his story in the midst of his deep darkness. And this is what he wrote. "Precious Lord, take my hand. Lead me on, let me stand. I am tired, I am weak, I am worn. Through the storm, through the night, lead me on to the light. Take my hand, precious Lord, lead me home."